My name is Mark Zuckerman. I'm president of the Century Foundation, and I want to tell you a little bit about Century. We recently celebrated our 100th anniversary. Yay, Century! We had an event with 300 people to celebrate, and at the event we shared our storied history of things like helping President Roosevelt craft the New Deal, spearheading the nationwide movement to expand credit unions, and leading the fight in Congress to oppose privatizing Social Security. But today, our issues are more of the kind of issues that you talk about around the kitchen table, whether you're going to have access to a good school, whether you have quality, affordable health care, and in particular, if you have a job that pays fair wages and good benefits, and one day, if Elliot and many of you have your way, work supported by quality, affordable child care for all who need it. I want to congratulate Elliot for his wonderful book, and I think we're going to have some copies in the back later. It's a compelling book. There's a lot to unpack in the book, and I'm looking forward to the discussion tonight about what we can do to turn the book into a reality. The discussion tonight will be moderated by Julie Kashen, who recently became the Director of Women's Economic Justice here at Century. Julie, I've known Julie for decades, and I can say this, that she has dedicated her life to women's equity issues, and she is one of the nation's outstanding experts and a real passion and heart for these issues, so we're just thrilled that she's joined Century in this new capacity. I also want to give a shout out to Levi, who's on our panel tonight, who's a policy entrepreneur and an expert. I'm calling you an expert on early childhood at Next 100. Next 100 is a new think tank that's run for and by the next generation of leaders, of which Levi and we have some other policy entrepreneurs here as well. And Emma Videra back there, raise your hand, Emma. She's the executive director of Next 100. So we look forward to hearing them. And I want to thank all the panelists that are here today. And thank you again for coming. And don't forget to sign up for our newsletter at tcf.org. Thanks again, Julie. It's all yours.
Thanks, Mark. We're so happy you're here. Century Foundation and Next 100 welcome you. A few housekeeping items. Bathrooms are around the corner. We are being recorded, so just know that. This is a tweetable event. You are welcome to tweet using the hashtag childcare4, the number 4 all, and crawling behind. And with that, I'll turn it to you.
Okay, we are thrilled that you are all here. Let me do a couple of brief introductions before we get started. Julie, you have had a storied career, and everywhere from working in Congress to New Jersey state government, working with advocacy groups, nonprofit organizations. Can you tell us a little bit more about your work here at the Century Foundation and you?
Yes, happy to. The through line for my work has always been about making sure that everyone can work and also raise a happy, healthy, secure family. And clearly, affordable, quality, flexible childcare is a huge part of that. And so when I was pregnant with my son, I happened to be working for the Make It Work campaign on bold childcare policy ideas. And when I came back from leave, I finished. And as I was kind of putting together my own patchwork of care from, caring for him myself, had help of a nanny a few days, had help of my mom a few days, I put the finishing touches on this childcare proposal. And it became part of the Child Care for Working Families Act, which is federal legislation that addresses affordability, flexibility, quality jobs, quality care. And while we were working on it, a lot of people said we were aiming too high, that we were thinking too big, that we were in this moment where childcare centers were closing because of lack of funding. And how could we be thinking about a $1 billion investment in childcare? And of course, we had to play defense and make sure childcare centers didn't close. But at the same time, I've always believed that dreaming big is going to change what's actually possible. And I think that it has. And so some of the work I've been doing here at Century, I worked with Katie Ham from the Center for American Progress on a blueprint for child care reform in the states, which is available here and on our website. And we're continuing that work both to think about pushing the envelope in states as well as on the federal level. And that's why I'm so excited to hear from Elliot about universal free child care and his big vision. So we're going to hear from Elliot and also Diana in just a moment. But first, I'd like to thank Levi for being a great partner in creating this event and ask him to tell you a little about himself.
Yeah, so as Mark mentioned, my name is Levi Bohanan. I am a policy entrepreneur with the Next 100 just across the street. I work in early childhood education and child care policy. And I was working in education policy more generally before coming to work at the Next 100. And my interest in education policy really began back in high school. I was going through a very tumultuous time in my life, and I had a high school teacher who was absolutely instrumental in making sure that I was going to finish high school and then go off to college. And in thinking about that, the role that one high school teacher had in my life, it does make you think about the role of early childhood educators and child care workers and the important work that they're doing and the power and opportunity that they have with kids every day. Your brain develops more between the ages of 0 to 5 than it ever will again. And we've got to make sure that those kids are getting invested in, and we've got to make sure that the early educator workforce is being invested in, as particularly through a racial and gender equity lens. That workforce is primarily made up of women, disproportionately women of color, and we've got to start investing in the landscape more broadly.
Thank you. Well, now we want to introduce you to Elliot Haspel. He is the author of Crawling Behind. America's Child Care Crisis and How to Fix It. He is a former public school teacher, and he actually has joined us from Virginia, where he is a program officer at the Robbins Foundation. So we're thrilled to have Elliot here.
And Diana is a nonprofit professional activist and mom from New York. She runs a blog and a podcast called Parenting and Politics. Diana is here representing MomsRising. So without further ado, please welcome our guests.
Good. Can you hear me? Yes? Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm so excited to be here. Before we start, I am going to say once again, tweet away, childcare for, number 4, all, and crawling behind. And you're at Elliot Haspel?
E. Haspel.
Yeah. E. Haspel, and I'm at Diana Limongi, which is my full name. All right, let's get to it. So I'm so excited because I finished this book a couple of days ago, and it's all highlighted. I have yes, yes, yes written all over the margins. So let's get right into the conversation.
All right.
Alrighty. Now let's talk about the problem, right? Why, your first chapter starts with an important question. Why isn't childcare free for families? Tell us a little bit about the problem.
Yeah, so we have this bizarre system in the United States that made some misguided sense in 1920. It makes no sense in 2020, where from the time a child is born until the time a child turns 5, we basically say to parents, good luck. You figure out a way to care for the kids. We might have a little bit of help for you if you're particularly hard up, but mostly good luck. Then, when your child turns 5, congratulations, we're taking over. And over the next 12, 13 years, we're going to put in $12, $15, $20,000 a year for your child's education and care. And the reason we have that very bizarre split comes basically down to the historical expectations of the role of women. And so I think you can't understand the current childcare crisis without understanding that for a very, very long time, which is not exactly news to anyone, we've expected women to take care of young children, and we have been very unhappy with the idea of mothers working. There's a quote I like to use, and I'm going to read it first and then tell you who it's from and when it's from. The quote is, "Good mother care during the earliest childhood is the surest way to produce useful and well-adjusted citizens. It doesn't make sense to let mothers go to work making dresses or tapping typewriters in an office and have them pay other people to do a poorer job of bringing up their own children. A day nursery or a baby farm is no good for an infant." Now, that quote is not from some reactionary conservative politician. It's not from the turn of the century. That is Dr. Spock, and that is in 1958. And so that, I think, gives you sort of some scope of the problem, is if that late into our history, you really thought it was a bad idea to separate young mothers and their children. You literally thought there was this science that said that it was harmful to do that. Why would you create a public child care system? In fact, that was the last thing you would want to do, is create a public child care system, and so we didn't. Except, of course, what happened is for the past 50 to 60 years, we've increasingly had mothers coming to the workforce, to the point that now we have 2/3 of all young children under 5 have their mothers in the workforce. That was about 20-ish% back in like 1950. We have no system to take them in. And we have, now we understand the child development and the neuroscience, which says it's actually children completely fine if you put them in a high-quality external care environment versus a parental care environment. So, and obviously society's expectations and on sort of what we are okay with women and mothers doing has evolved, thankfully, over the past 100 years. So we're in this place where we've evolved on all of these things: the need for care, the role of women, and the understanding of child development, but we still don't have a system. And so we're sort of stuck in we're between this rock and the hard place, and that's kind of a lot of the genesis of why it's not free.
Okay. And when we think of who is impacted, we often think it's low-income families who are impacted by the lack of kind of free and affordable and available to all childcare. But I think that's a common misconception. Tell us a little bit about, tell us, are the families that are most impacted low-income families? Is that true?
So I would say the families who are most impacted are the lower income families, but not the only families that are impacted. And one of the reasons I even started writing this book is I kept having this conversation with the peers. My wife is thankfully here with me today, and we were talking with our peers, most of whom early 30s, 2 were in our families, college degrees, and in so many cases graduate degrees, and we're struggling. Like childcare is just a huge burden on the budget, and that was part of what I'm realizing. If we're struggling, that means everyone who's less fortunate is also must be struggling even more. So the pain point has badly penetrated the middle class. The pain point in many cases has penetrated into the upper middle class, which is part of, for better or for worse, I think why it's getting more attention nationally. But it's also important to understand that, particularly for millennial parents, right, particularly parents of our generation, and even as Generation Z is starting to have kids, we're also dealing with additional pressures of sort of this kind of late capitalist system we're dealing with, right? We have rising rents, we have relatively stagnant wages, we have lots of student loan debt, we have lots of medical debt, we have lots of credit card debt. And so all of that makes the relative burden of childcare costs even deeper. And then you have supply, Julia was saying, starting to dwindle. We've lost half of our family childcare providers, half in the past about 15 years, down from a 200,000 family childcare in-home providers to about 100,000. So options are dwindling, costs are rising, the relative cost burden is increasing. So this is, unless you're really, truly, incredibly, good for you, you're really rich, this is a problem for you.
Yeah. That I have a college degree, my postgraduate degree, and so does my husband, and that's exactly what you described is exactly what I experience and what I see around me. My working moms group, that's absolutely right. It's just incredibly stressful, so yeah. So the first time I heard childcare being described as a broken marketplace, it was like, oh, eureka, this is what it is. So explain why childcare is a broken marketplace. I think that's brilliant, the way that's described.
Well, thank you. So it's broken in a couple of ways, and ultimately, it is what I think most economists would consider it in a state of market failure. A market works when a few laws are supposed to be in place. So one of them is when demand goes up, supply goes up. And so since we're seeing that's not happening, but it's not happening because parents can't afford what it would cost to get a quality child care. Because you have to remember, childcare is expensive, and it should be expensive. Very low adult-to-child ratios are what you want. You want highly trained teachers. You want highly supported practitioners. You have to have all the health and safety pieces in place. All of these things are things that you have to have. And so when something's expensive, it costs more money. I often liken this to kind of earthquake-proof buildings in California. Melissa and I used to live in San Francisco, and it was very comforting to know that the city had spent, additional money making sure that if an earthquake happened, the building wasn't going to fall down. And in this case, we're not talking about buildings. We're talking about the literal wiring of children's brains. And so we don't want it cut right. But when you have a place where parents can't afford the true cost of care, and we have to remember, parents are tapped out, basically paying into a system where providers are so hard up that they're paying their teachers and their educators basically minimum wage. The average wage for a center-based teacher in this country is somewhere around $11 or $12 an hour. So it's not like providers are raking in all of these parent fees and then, going off to party in Aruba. They're actually the profit margin of running a child care program is basically 1% or less. So it's not working for the providers, who are then, many of them are closing or slashing wages. And now we're actually, the fun side effect of all this is now we're in a labor shortage in the child care sector, because as places like Amazon and Target in this tight market have started to raise wages, we're seeing like a hemorrhage of staff to those places. And then we're seeing parents unable to pay into it. So parents don't actually have true options in the market. That's the other thing, right? Like if you want to go and say, I want to buy some oranges, then you have to have the purchasing power to say, I can choose between different sort of options. And here, in many cases, parents are being forced not only not to utilize the current licensed care market, they're being forced to make some really hard choices. Down to, and we're seeing this, and this is more sort of a long-run existential issue, not having more kids. We're seeing a lot of millennial parents saying, I would like to have another kid, and I'm not going to because I don't know how I'm going to afford it. And even if I could afford it, I can't find anyone in my area that is providing this care. The Center for American Progress has done a lot of great work on sort of what they call child care deserts, which means basically there's not a sort of licensed slot available, like less than a ratio of 1 for 3, and that's a huge problem in huge swaths of America, and not just big cities like New York City. This is true in rural America, this is true in suburban America, this is true in red states and blue states. To your point earlier about like who's this affects everyone nationwide. So the market is not working for anyone. It's not working for parents, it's not working for providers, and it's certainly not working for children.
That's another thing that I hear as a mom, and I thought my children are 6 years apart, and because for a while I was like, this is impossible. Like I cannot. And it's definitely something that parents are constantly talking about. I wish I could, but the numbers it doesn't make sense financially. Yeah. So you have a whole chapter devoted to quality. Tell us about the different care settings and how quality shows up in each of them, and what role that plays in the teacher and caregiver compensation as well.
Yeah, so early childhood is a really interesting age range because it turns out most of the research says what setting care is being delivered in is significantly less important than the quality of that care. And quality in early childhood, we're talking about infants, toddlers, 4-year-olds, is mostly defined by the quality of the caregiver-child relationship. Is it a trusting relationship? Does the child feel like there's a warmth there? Does the caregiver paying attention to what sort of the child is giving out and following that child's interest? Like quality is much more about that than any, no one sitting down and giving a lesson on, photosynthesis to, right, like a toddler. And so because of that, the settings vary widely, and that's actually A-okay. So you see sort of 4 or 5 main kind of settings where care is delivered. One, of course, is parental care. So the parent is taking care, or guardian is taking care of the child full time. Another one is what we call in the field of friends, family, or neighbor care. This is something called kith or kin care. Basically, this is grandma, this is the neighbor down the street, this is an aunt or a cousin, someone who's related to you or is sort of a kind of very close, might as well be related to you because, is taking care of your child. The third is these family child cares, and this is someone who's providing care to a small group of children in their home. It's called family child care because it's care delivered in the home of another family, not in the child's own home. And nannies and au pairs kind of fall somewhere in between those, but that's actually not that many sort of as far as the sector goes. And then the other big bucket, of course, is sort of what we sort of consider formal care. These are your centers, your churches and JCCs and other providers from religious backgrounds, so the Head Starts, state pre-K, all of that. So it's a very diverse mosaic of providers, but the wonderful thing, I think the opportunity we have is if we can make sure that there's enough funding and support going into all of those, and then we can make sure that there's quality kind of guardrails everywhere, then we can give parents the choice of the setting that works best for them, and still make sure that child is on a trajectory that, to have sort of healthy brain development, healthy physical development, and be set up for success later in school and in life.
And that's exactly what my next question is about. You talk a lot about parental choice in the book, and it's something I appreciate because I know that for parents, childcare is not one size fits all. Like what worked for your first child may not necessarily work for your second child. What works in New York City might not work in, Portland. And you mentioned a few things that are important for parents, like a caregiver being of the same cultural background or speaking the same language, which for me was absolutely like top of my list. Talk to us a little bit about why parental choice is so important in childcare.
Yeah, so I think it's important for two reasons. One, which is more, I almost consider it sort of practical or more moral, and the other is political, frankly. And the first one is that because setting matters more than the actual, because quality matters more than setting, it doesn't really make sense to say to parents, like, you have to pretend your infant to center, right? Like there is something that just rubs that very wrong about sort of the encroaching on the parental prerogative. It's a very different conversation, I think, when you get to the sort of K-12 system, because then again, children have advanced to a certain age. There's more skills and content knowledge. Although even then, we have the ability of parents to choose to homeschool if they want. So part of it is honoring parental choice, right? A parent should be able to say, I want to be home with my child in these early years, and that's what I want to do, and I'm going to do it. I want them to be with this, if I am a child care provider, because I know that person is going to be with them for multiple years, and I really value that cozy home environment. And I think the center feels a little sterile. Or I really love that center down the street, and I think it's great that they're like larger group sizes, and they're going to get to interact with a lot of different kids, and the teachers, have slightly different backgrounds, and all of that should be okay. And that switches into the political, which is, because every survey of parents of young children, from pretty much any time I've ever seen one, says that there's a whole lot of ambivalence about what they want to do. Some of them feel like they should be home. Some of them feel like they don't want someone who's not related to them taking care of them. There's a very wide variety of preferences, and I worry as we start to switch to start talking about the solutions, if we start to say, as a policy stance, you must do one thing when it comes to early care and education, that we're going to lose, like the bottom is going to fall out of all of the people who don't feel like that's actually the proper thing to do or what they want to do with their own children. I think any of us with young children, I know you're a mom, and that's like, there's a protectiveness always with your children, but when they're very, very young, I think it's intense. And so centering family choice, particularly since we know that that's going to be okay for the kid if we can get them into a quality setting, I think that has to be front and center.
I agree. Now we're going to talk about solutions.
Yeah.
This is the good stuff. Now, this is a little bit, not as uplifting, but Elliot has great ideas. So you've laid out a strong case regarding the challenges, but now tell us about your proposed solution.
I will, and I will say this with a caveat that I always say, which is I am not as wedded to my particular solution is to a solution that honors a few core tenets. One, which is I think we need to start talking about every child deserves the right to a quality early care and education starting at birth, just the way that we say every child has a right to public education starting at age 5. I think number 2, parents should not pay $1 beyond their taxes for it. I think number 3, that all practitioners of religion should be incredibly well compensated and incredibly well supported in their work. So
that deserves a round of applause. I love all of that.
So all that to say, like, if the ultimate solution ends up looking very different than what I'm about to say, like, I am happy to get on board with that. But where I did land is sort of this idea of offering what I call child development credits, although they're not tax credits. It's more maybe a child development trust fund might be a way to think about it. Basically, it's saying to every parent, we are going to give you $15,000 a year base in a higher cost of living city like New York City. This might look like more like $20,000 or $25,000. It's going to be in a special bank account, and you're going to be able to draw it down, much like a flexible spending account or a health savings account, to use to acquire the care of your choice. And it's going to be per child, and it's going to be from the time that they're born until the time that they're ready to enter our public school system. And I think the value of this is a couple of things. One, it means that parents, it's going to zero out the cost of care for parents. So we need that. Two, if you're giving everyone in New York $25,000 a year to spend on childcare, what it means is that all the family childcares and childcare centers can suddenly raise the rates to $25,000, which is what they should be charging, right? They should be charging that or potentially even more. So and that's gonna amount of money all of a sudden clears those providers to pay their teachers decent wages, to provide those sort of professional development supports that we want. So the idea is basically if we start by saying that parents are going to be able to have access to this and they're going to be able to use it to make the choices that they want. I will throw in there that I'm actually I think there should be a self-pay option. This is that in terms of paying stay-at-home parents. I think it's way past time we started paying stay-at-home parents. They're doing work. It is very demanding work. And I think work deserves to be compensated, even if I mentioned though it might be work that's kind of has love surrounding it, but it's still work. And that's actually an idea that many Northern European nations do too. So, but that's basically the core idea is let's give all parents a sum of money dedicated to their children's care that they can access and use the way they want for their children's early childhood.
And you mentioned that doing so would allow centers to raise their tuition. I guess I'm going to call it tuition. What they charge, and that would allow centers to pay teachers kind of a living wage, because a lot of times we don't think that a lot of these teachers qualify for like SNAP benefits because they're really making like minimum. In New York, I think it's $15 an hour right now, minimum wage. But so that would be amazing. Lift a lot of people out of poverty also.
Yes, it would lift a lot of people out of poverty. I think it's a huge anti-poverty play. I also think, and you're right, like the fact is half of our early care workforce is accessing some kind of public benefit because they're making such little money. Somewhere around half to 75% of them say that they on some level worry about things like putting food on their table or paying their monthly bills. And that level, or much less providing childcare for their own children. And that's not the stress level you want from the people who are doing a work which, like I mentioned, like at its core requires like attentiveness and presence, and like that's not what we want for children in their most vulnerable years, is to be putting them in front of a workforce who are, by the way, someone said this at an event we were at yesterday, by and large, the early care workforce has been subsidizing, arguably through exploitive measures, and the fact that we haven't had a system, the entire rest of the country in paying their fees. And again, as Levi mentioned, this was a workforce that's almost universally female and predominantly women of color. So someone was making the point, I thought it was very poignant, that basically we're starting out with we're sending our youngest children in front of a workforce that the first thing we're teaching them in life is that we should exploit women of color to subsidize the rest of us, and that's that has to change. So.
And how does your proposal compare or relate to the bills that have been introduced, like the Child Care for Working Families Act and the Universal Child Care and Early Learning Act?
So I think we come from very similar tenets. We land in, main difference I'll say in one thing, although I want to stop for a minute and say, the reason we're having this conversation today is largely because of people like Julie and Katie Ham and the generation before of people who have been working on this issue. Back in the 1990s, the Carnegie Corporation, whenever we were calling this a quiet crisis, that's what reports were saying, as late as the 1990s. It's not quiet anymore. Like, we're talking about it. We're talking about these big ideas. And so we stand on the shoulders, I think, of those hard-fought, inches and hard-fought steps. And so to get to this point, honestly, the main difference is most of those proposals offer a cap, essentially, of how much a parent would have to pay. Mostly it's around 7% of their income, with parents making under a certain percentage of the median income paying nothing. So it would make it free for large swaths of sort of lower income and lower middle income families. And then it would have a sliding scale that capped up at 7%. I say universally free, and it's more of a philosophical difference. So my sort of stance on this is, when something is a common good, when we say as a country, we care enough about this, and this has enough benefit that everyone's going to get this for free, even if they could afford to pay for it, then that often gets you to a different political terrain. And so for an example, think about fire departments, right? None of us pay for fire departments. Bill Gates doesn't pay for the fire beyond taxes. Jeff Bezos, and no one does. And so, could Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos pay for the fire service for that? Absolutely. Could they pay to send their children to their local public schools and pay the $15,000, $20,000 per pupil expenditure themselves? Absolutely. We don't ask them to, though, and I say that's a feature, not a bug. That's part of the whole communal idea. And so where I go to free, I think there's a lot of power in saying universally free for everyone, regardless of income, no means test. I think that just shifts you into a more communal space when you're talking about the politics of it, and it also makes it a lot more politically robust. Because again, someone I've seen on Twitter sort of argued, you're basically bribing the rich people so that they're not going to take this away when the economy tanks. And okay, on some level, that might be what the cost of doing business. Because what we've seen time and time again is that the means-tested programs, these public assistance programs, get on the chopping block the second the economy starts to even hint of taking a turn, whereas universal programs tend to be much more protected. And this is something that in international early childhood systems as well, they found that the countries that tend to have the most robust early childhood systems have them universally available.
So you mentioned before it used to be called a quiet crisis, people are quietly talking about it. It wasn't so why do you think now?
Yeah, so I think now for a couple of reasons. I think one is what I mentioned earlier, the pain point is just out there. Middle class, upper middle class families, millennial parents suffering from this. And so all of a sudden we're seeing, it's on the Democratic primary debate stage. The White House is holding a summit on family issues that involves child care. This is Ivanka Trump, one of the things she's taken on. We're coming from, I know. But for better or worse, it does, this is something people are paying attention to. And we've seen, in red states and in blue. And so there's a moment where people are paying attention. And I think now is when we have to strike and say, okay, great, you've noticed there's a problem. The answer isn't going to be just increasing subsidy a little bit here or increasing pre-K for 4-year-olds a little bit there. Let's start talking about what the true structural reasons are and how we actually put a design vision that in 10, 20 years, we move ourselves to having universal, free, high quality, fully accessible, parental choice focused early care and education for every single child in this country. And I think until we put that out, I think that's going to be, this is the time to start building that movement. This is the time to start having that conversation, because these big social changes, if we get them rolling down the mountain, they can happen quickly. You look at, 1900, if I was sitting in front of this room and said this was America's secondary school crisis, right? Because in the year 1900, basically 10% of American teenagers were going to high school. And I was sitting up here and I was saying, I think we need to start talking about having universal access to high school, right? It's going to be pretty darn expensive. I think we need to do it. And some people will have laughed at, us in the room. By 1940, you have over 60% of American teenagers in high school. This happens rapidly, and by now, obviously, it's the thought of not having high school be part of the system just is kind of comical. So, and similarly, if you look at sort of federal spending or government spending on transportation in 1950 versus 1960, the graph is basically a straight line up, because what happened is that we got highways, and so you've got all of these examples of GI Bill and higher education. Where if we can start to build the will, if we can paint a really bold vision of the way forward, and if we force our policymakers and our think tanks and our everyone to put numbers behind it and say it's actually going to cost this much money, and here's how we're going to do it. We're going to phase it in with this tax here and that tax there, then after the first 5 years, and this tax after the next 5 years, and here's how much money we know we're going to get back for having parents back into the workforce. I actually think you can lay out a plan that gets us there, that we're going to look back. And this is my closing thought. I think we're going to look back around the year 2050, and we're going to look as kind of agog at the fact that we didn't have universal, high-quality early care and education, as we look back now to, Dr. Spock writing in 1958, or, the American high schools in 1900. So I think we have a moment.
Okay. Can I do a time check? I didn't.
Yeah.
Oh.
The time check is stop.
We can go ahead and shift, if that's okay?
That's good.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. So we're going to go ahead and shift into our interactive portion of the evening. Please join me in thanking our wonderful armchair discussion, Elliot and Diana.
Great.
So as they come down off the stage, I'm going to talk briefly about what we're going to be doing next. What we're going to be doing is talking in our interactive groups. I see there are some folks in the back. If you wouldn't mind either joining a table, we have some spots up here. I promise I'm friendly. Or you can scoot your chair up to a table near you. We're going to be digging in around these interactive group at our tables, and hopefully an interactive group session. We're going to be digging into universal childcare and hopefully learn from some of the expertise here in the room. I'm going to do a brief introduction of the moderators that are at each table. So moderators, please wave as I introduce you. We've got Julie, and then I'll also be a moderator. We also have Dawn Heyward, who currently serves as the Deputy Director of Early Childhood Education at East Side House Settlement. We have Raquel Crutcher, who is a policy entrepreneur at the Next 100. We have Hallie Potter, Senior Fellow at the Century Foundation, and we have Lucy Muirhead, who is the Chief Strategy Officer at the Century Foundation. Moderators have in front of them a list of questions that are designed in response to the armchair discussion that we just heard. We know that this conversation can go on all night, but we're going to try to cap it at just around 20-ish minutes. So I will go ahead and kick it over to the moderators. And as you speak up, please make sure you introduce yourself. And please, we're excited to hear from you. After about 20-ish minutes, then we're going to transition into our closing panel.
Integrate this. Let's hear from everyone and have all of these voices as part of the conversation. So I'm going to ask the moderators who are part of the closing panel to come up, and we're going to just kind of close us out. We're going to reflect the conversations that we had at our tables and share our own perspectives as well. And after we finish up, we're going to have some time to socialize. So thanks for being such great participants in the interactive portion. And Diana, please come back up.
Okay. What is this? Okay, as we are getting settled, thank you all for participating in our conversations. I have a couple of questions, but I really want the conversations that we had in the groups to lead this panel. I know I had some really great conversations around affordability, what universal means, what choice means, and I want to make sure that we uplift that and some of the learnings that y'all had as well. So can we do a brief quick introduction just in case everybody didn't see everybody? So I'm Levi.
Julie Kashen.
Diana, is this on? Yes, Diana.
So on Heyward.
Great. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump right into it. What did your group think about universal childcare? Pro or anti?
I think we're definitely pro,
Go
right,
ahead.
team? Pro. We had a very thoughtful, insightful, and educated conversation about universal childcare and what that meant, what the definition would be, how we would support it in terms of funding, even a brief discussion in terms of funding sources and what would need to change at different levels. So city, state, and federal in terms of eligibility and what criteria, and also a really robust conversation about infrastructure and what that would have to look like, right? So we talked policy, we talked micro, we talked macro.
Well, I'm just going to leave after that. She said it all. Really, I have nothing to add. That's everything. We discussed what it meant to us, and we said that it was really important for it to be universal for everyone, regardless of social class, of race, of immigration status. We discussed a little about what universal childcare would look like in terms of paid leave, like how, if that would overlap, what would that be like? And then there's a very robust conversation about what if people want to stay home and what that would look like, and people should be paid because it is work, like Elliot mentioned. And you know, we have to give parents the opportunity to stay home, both genders of parents. So yeah, we floated around the idea of 2 years of paid leave. Yeah.
I like that.
And we also talked about kind of looking at what the economic costs of not having a universal child care policy were, in terms of like human capital and brain drain. And we talked a lot about kind of, we need the political will to make this a reality.
Yeah. I'm so glad that you brought up family leave, because we talked a little bit in my group about this continuum of care, right? So we talk about preschool, we talk about childcare, we talk about family leave, but really there's this continuum. There's no like artificial, like once you turn 3, then your brain develops in this different way, or once you turn 8, your brain develops in a different way. It really is, you know, your brain is constantly developing when you're this age, and making sure that there's a solution for each step is part of it. Julie?
I think echo what most said, and I think we had a conversation. Part of our conversation was about how choice costs a lot of money, and that we do not know the true cost of care right now, and that it's hard to find out. And the true cost of care, you know, is not what we're spending right now, right? As you know, as Elliot said, we need to be putting a lot more money into the system, and so we need some answers around that. We also need to be talking about equitable access and the workforce, and how we treat people in the workforce. We need predictable schedules so that parents can, you know, be there for their kids, and their kids can have regular, predictable childcare options. And so it's a whole ecosystem, really, and we need to be thinking about all the different parts of it.
Yeah. So my group talked about choice as well, and we compared it to the current choice system that exists here in New York whenever you're enrolling your student in K-12 education, right? Where in order to be well, in order to have this conversation well, you really do have to dive deep into like the way that the public education system works. Somebody in my group shared that they went and visited over a dozen different schools, trying to figure out which one would be the right to send their child to. And that is like a conversation around privilege, right? Being able to access, to take time off of work, to go and visit schools, to be able to have those conversations with teachers. There's a lot of work there. And so if we're here in early learning with that same kind of like ecosystem around choice exist. So I want to ask everybody.
I just wanted to add, we said that we should think about it as a women's issue, not as a woman's issue, but as a societal issue. That was really important.
Totally.
Our group also talked about the collective burden of society, that it's not just parents, and it's not just a certain group of people, because maybe my children, maybe I don't have children, or maybe my children are older, and so I'm not particularly vested or interested in early childhood education because it might not personally affect me at that time, but it is a societal issue. Those will be your doctors, those will be your lawyers, those will be your Congress people and your president and all of those people, your teachers, right? Your firefighters, and so it's a collective burden on society. When I say burden, like loosely.
I totally agree, and I want to just put out one more perspective around this, which is that I do think it's important to talk about gender and race as part of this conversation. So while it is a societal issue, I think that if you start the conversation there and you don't talk about the ways it impacts women or people of color disproportionately, your solutions are not going to be equitable. And so on the one hand, it's a huge economic issue. It impacts businesses, but at its core, it is impacting women more than anyone. It is impacting communities of color more than anyone. And so if we don't start there and at least acknowledge that, call that out, and look for solutions that start there, I think it's going to be a problem.
I was at a conference in Geneva that was where the ILO was presenting, and it was a study of 77 countries, and they said that the care issue is the main reason for gender inequality in the world. So I mean, we're dealing with child care and elder care, but to not talk about this as also a gender issue is to leave out what's really true.
Yep. Yep. Absolutely. So what's something that we have not talked enough about today, either in the book conversation or around their groups? Like, what's something that's in the front of your mind that we have not discussed enough?
I think one issue that needs more attention is how to support children and parents with disabilities. I think we are talking about something universal, and we are talking about something that impacts everyone, and there's more cost involved. There's more issues involved, right? And I think that needs to be an important part of the conversation.
I think when we talk about equity and to go back to really highlight the issue as it relates to our workforce, that we would be remiss to not do that at this juncture. To talk about the fact that we have a dying workforce, right? It's non-existent. People are not going to school to learn how to be teachers anymore. There is a significant shortage in speech pathologists, which is one of the number one services that children with special needs have. As a former special education teacher, I know that right well. And the fact that we cannot get particularly bilingual speech therapists in our schools, which takes me to my other issue that I think we would be remiss to not bring up, is our immigrant families. And so we pride ourselves as New Yorkers on being very diverse, having a diverse community and communities. And I think that access, when we talk about access, when we talk about those who are marginalized, we cannot forget our immigrant families and their needs. Not only the need to feel like they can come and they can be safe in that space, but that their needs will be cared for and their children will get the education that they need, and also that they themselves will be engaged and lifted up. We talk about Head Start. Well, we need a Head Start, right?
And after all of that, I think we need to talk about what we can do, right? Like, give us an action list. Let's talk about that.
Totally. I will add one quick thing, as I and Elliot talked a little bit about this at the top. I am curious to learn more about millennial parents, right? And so how millennial parents are engaging with childcare. I think it's something like 22% of college parents, or college students are parents, and I'm interested to figure out whether or not those college parents feel supported, what kind of supports we can provide for them, and how millennials are engaging with childcare more generally. So what are some of the solutions? Did your group get to solutions? Did y'all fix childcare, or are we still working on it?
I don't know that we fixed it, but we definitely didn't fix it. But I think we did start to talk about private and public partnership and what that could look like and how that could sustain the system in a very global way in terms of infrastructure, facilities. As we bring more children in or look to service more families, we will need space. And what those spaces look like and how those spaces are funded and how they're maintained, those are things that we thought about. We also talked a little bit about the various entities that are the players, so to speak. Department of Health, Department of Buildings, and we talked a little bit about those interfaces and some of the struggles there, but really the partnership between public and private funding and the ability to work towards one goal. So that definitely is a solution we talked about.
I like Elliot's proposal. That's me
Good.
personally. I'm not speaking for the entire group, but I like this idea of it being a common good.
Yeah.
Yeah, we had a lot of good ideas. And one of the things we talked a little bit about was, what's the role of the federal government versus state versus local? And that when you need an investment that's as big as the investment we need, I think federal needs to be a part of it, and also setting a baseline and talking about it as a universal right. That means we need a federal involvement. And then when you get into more of the details, especially around quality, there is a little bit more flexibility you might want, especially as we think about cultural differences and cultural sensitivities. And so we talked about how complicated it is and didn't get to that solution. But I'm also just going to take a moment to answer Diana's very serious question about action, which, I think there's a lot we can do. One of the things I think is really interesting is that we've been, for the last 4 or 5 years, having a conversation about universal free college. I'd be very excited if the folks in this room started to do more talking about universal free childcare and early learning. That means you can do that in your social media settings. That means you can do that in, conversations that you're having on panels, and in the writing that you do, and including the continuum of care, as we've talked about, stay-at-home parents and their role, paid parental leave, the workforce, all of those different pieces. I'll also give a shameless plug. I help to manage a Facebook group called the Movement for Grassroots Childcare and Early Education. Join our Facebook group, join the movement. It is a growing movement, and I think there's some real opportunities to be a part of it. MomsRising has been a great part of that too.
Got it. So what's something that gives you hope for the future? We've talked a lot about problems that we're facing. We've talked about economic loss. We've talked about how this is disproportionately negatively impacting women and women of color. What's something that brings you hope when we talk about the future of childcare policy?
Looking around at the champions that are in the room gives hope. Hearing and speaking and looking at professionals coming in every day, they might not be exactly happy with their pay and the compensation, but they're wed to the mission. And the mission is to make a difference, to make an impact in the lives of children and families. And so I'm very hopeful that there are enough champions and each one can bring another champion along with us, and that we could really make a difference.
She took my answer. I was going to say that. Okay, I'll say something else. As we were talking with Elliot and in my groups, I thought a lot about my childcare provider. And, I have an 8-year-old and I have a 2-year-old. And my daughter now goes to the daycare that my son went to. And it's a small daycare. There are 2 rooms. And I thought about, as we were discussing, I thought about what they must earn. I have no idea what it is, but I imagine that it's not very high. And all I kept thinking in the back of my mind was they show so much love to the children that they work with. They're always smiling. My daughter, we were on vacation. She was talking about them every single day. She has a big smile on her face when we pick her up. She is excited to go there. You feel the love, and that keeps me hopeful, because I think that those are the people that we have to kind of fight for as well, because they're the people that are taking care of our children. And if they're not happy and they're not, supported, then our children are going to suffer.
Amen. I'm an optimist in general, but a lot of things are giving me hope. So I think, Washington, D.C. passed Birth to 3 for All. And they also have universal pre-K, and they also have paid family medical leave. So they have not fully funded their program, but they did put together this comprehensive approach. It exists. They passed it into law, right? So we are seeing progress. It is happening. That's one thing. Another, Elliot mentioned, we're hearing about this in the primary debates. In fact, every single primary debate so far has brought up childcare, including the last debate where 4 different candidates talked about childcare in somewhat knowledgeable fashion, at least. And so we're in a very different moment. I had the good fortune to be a part of the first grassroots assembly for childcare and early education in 2018, where we brought together 250 advocates, activists, teachers, providers, parents, to talk about what was possible for childcare and early education. They were from 25 different states, and the conversation was led by women of color, and it was really powerful, and felt like the beginning of something. We had a regional assembly in Detroit this past year and 2 more plans in different regions, and so a movement is building. And finally, just the publication of this book and the fact that we can start to have this conversation about universal and free. I think all of those things give me hope, and all of you give me hope.
Yeah. So I think that's right. I think that the only thing that I would add to that is that there is this urgency that's becoming palpable, right? Like there are, I think the statistic is like 2 out of 3 children under the age of 5 are being raised in households where both parents work. And so there is this urgency, this recognition for all parents. Yeah. Yes. Thank you. All parents, absolutely. But there is this recognition for parents that work that there needs to be some sort of access to childcare, and watching that momentum and urgency grow has been very fulfilling. So that wraps up our time. Thank you so much. Oh, do you want to?
I just want to say a few quick things, which
Yeah.
are that not every group was represented up here, but we have asked your moderators to take detailed notes that we're going to take a look at and process. Thank you for doing that. Just thank you to John and Casey and Solio and Jonay and everyone and our moderators and everyone who's been so helpful in making this a reality. This is the first time Levi and I got to do a project together. It was a lot of fun to work together. So thank you all so much. And a special shout out to Elliot, who's the reason we're here. Let's give him one more round of applause.
Great. Well, now we have the fun part. There's wine, and there's also going to be some snacks. Elliot is going to be at the back with some of his books. I know I'm going to ask him to sign my copy. I'm very excited about that. But feel free to mingle, and if I don't know you, please come up and introduce yourself. I would be delighted to make new friends.
Thanks, everyone.